Howdy, and welcome to another in the continuing series of Conversations in Public Policy, sponsored by the Mosbacher Institute for Trade, Economics, and Public Policy of the Bush School of Government, pardon me, the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University. My name is Mark Welsh, and I'm privileged to be the Dean of the Bush School of Government and Public Service. And my job tonight is just to welcome you to the event and introduce you to a couple of special guests we have joining us tonight. Let me start by reminding you that the conversation this evening is titled, Where Do We Go From Here? The Economic Outlook for 2021, which is an incredibly pertinent topic and very timely, as you've seen throughout the course of the recent presidential election run-up. First of all, tonight we have with us some Bush School Advisory Board members, both past and present. We have Mr. Grayson and Ms. Rebecca Davis with us tonight. We're also joined by Chuck and Teddy Ellison, as well as Ambassador Chase Untermeyer, who is not just a member of our Bush School Advisory Board, but also a veteran of the George H.W. Bush administration, where he served as the director of the Office of Presidential Personnel. A couple of special guests have joined us tonight as well. Elizabeth Cunha, who is a newly elected College Station City Council member, is with us tonight. Thank you, ma'am, for joining. We also have Mr. Brandon Simon from Senator Ted Cruz's office. Brandon, we really appreciate you taking the time to join. A very, very special guest for us tonight is Mr. Robert Mosbacher Jr., the chairman of Mosbacher Energy Company and son of the Mosbacher Institute's namesake, Robert Mosbacher Sr. Sir, we are really, really honored to have you with us. There are also some alumni from the George H.W. Bush administration here, along with Ambassador Untermeyer. First, Mr. John Rodabaugh, who was President Bush's appointee to the National Labor Relations Board, and then three members of Secretary Mosbacher's Commerce Cabinet, Mr. Rob Carter, Mr. Mark Lieberman, and Mr. Bruce Soll. So thank you especially to all of you for joining us tonight. We're honored that you would. I think you're going to enjoy this conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, now let me introduce the director of the Mosbacher Institute, a phenomenal professor and a phenomenal human being, actually, Dr. Raymond Robertson.
Thank you very much, Dean Welch, for that very generous introduction, and welcome to all of our distinguished guests. It's such an honor for me to be hosting this event tonight for someone who's really amazing in so many ways. I'm really honored to introduce our esteemed speaker, Dr. Doug Holtz-Eakin. Dr. Doug Holtz-Eakin has a distinguished record as an academic, policy advisor, and strategist. Currently, he is the president of the American Action Forum, or AAF, which he founded in 2009 to provide data-driven insight into the United States defining domestic policy challenges. He writes a daily column in the AAF's morning newsletter, The Daily Dish, and regularly comments on current policy and political debates for a variety of news outlets. Dr. Holtz-Eakin gave his career a start at Columbia University and later at Syracuse University, building an international reputation as a scholar doing research in the areas of applied economic policy, econometric methods, and entrepreneurship. Beginning in 1989, Doug Holtz-Eakin moved into a series of influential policy positions. He served on the President's Council of Economic Advisors, first as a senior staff economist and then as the chief economist, where he helped to formulate policies addressing the 2000 to 2001 recession and the aftermath of the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001. From 2003 to 2005, he served as the sixth director of the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, which provides budgetary and policy analysis to the US Congress. During his tenure, the CBO assisted Congress as they addressed numerous policies, notably the 2003 tax cuts, the 2003 Medicare prescription drug bill, and the 2005 push for Social Security reform. During 2007 and 2008, Holtz-Eakin was the director of the domestic and economic policy for the John McCain presidential campaign. After that, he was a commissioner on the congressionally chartered Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission. He holds a PhD from Princeton University, a bachelor's from Denison University, and I will say that he was the chair, as I mentioned, while he was at Syracuse, the chair of the economics department, where he, up until that point, was the best boss that I had ever had until I came to the Bush School. But before I welcome Dr. Holtz-Eakin to the screen, I'd like to introduce the evening's conversation partner, Dr. Laurie Taylor. Dr. Laurie Taylor, as most of you know, is the head of the Public Service and Administration Department and holds the Joe R. and Teresa Lozano Long Chair in Business and Government at the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M. She was the director of the Mosbacher Institute for Trade, Economics, and Public Policy from 2014 to 2018 and left me very large shoes to fill, and I'm doing my best to fill them. Taylor has written extensively on public sector efficiency and served as a consultant on school finance issues for a variety of legislative committees and state and federal agencies. Prior to joining the Bush School, Taylor spent 14 years as an economist and policy advisor in the research department of the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. Taylor holds a PhD in economics from the University of Rochester and both a BA in economics and a BS in business administration from the University of Kansas. I would now like to welcome both Dr. Holtz-Eakin to give remarks about where do we go from here, the economic outlook for 2021. Thank you for joining us tonight, Doctor.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the very generous introduction. And I will go on record as being perfectly honest, saying it was a delight to work with Dr. Robertson and pleased to be here tonight. More generally, it's an honor and a privilege. Thank you. I was fortunate enough to serve in the George H.W. Bush administration. I was at the Council of Economic Advisors, and I met, but was hardly close friends with Secretary Mosbacher during his tenure at the Department of Commerce. The one thing I will say about that experience is it was one of the most important life lessons I've ever learned. I went to the Council of Economic Advisors because I had become discouraged when teaching at Columbia. I sort of started to think there was no particular value to publishing academic articles in obscure and sort of narrow specialized journals. And you wonder if your students are listening to you sometimes when you're lecturing. And in a sort of early midlife crisis, I decided to go do something real. And I went to the White House, and there I learned something very important. While no single research paper is definitive, the large body of academic research is what constrains the policy process. It is the most important source of constraints that allow you to definitively say that's not going to happen, even if you can't always say exactly what's going to happen. And it gave me a renewed faith in the research mission. And I found that during my time there, I spent most of my days in meetings teaching economics to non-specialists in other areas. And so it was an enormous confidence booster and sent me back to Syracuse University for another 12 years, convinced that a life of research, teaching, and public service was exactly the right combination. And that's what I've tried to do ever since. What I hope to do tonight is lay out a little bit about the near-term outlook, some of our longer-term challenges, but first and foremost, answer the questions that you might have, and I'd be happy to do that. So the title is Where Do We Go From Here? And to understand where we go, we have to understand how we got here. And it's important to recognize that this is a recession unlike any other recession in U.S. history. 20th century recessions were typically income-driven, largely industrial, inventory correction kinds of things where you cut back on production, laid some people off. They didn't have as much money. They stopped spending. You sort of got to spiral down. Eventually, the inventories were run out. You sort of started production back up, and you got the virtuous upward recovery. 21st century recessions until now have been financial market events that spilled over to the Main Street economy. We had a dot-com bubble back at the turn of the century, and then, of course, the financial crisis and Great Recession in 2007, 2008. This is very different. The U.S. economy was growing at about 2.5%, solid, if not spectacular growth, coming into 2020. It continued to do so in January, February, into May. But at mid-May, with the clear rise in virus cases and the declaration of a public health emergency, we saw a dramatic thing happen. People literally started to hide from the virus. And in particular, people in high-income zip codes stopped consuming services that involved being around other people. They did not go to restaurants. They did not get on airplanes and go to hotels. They didn't go to concerts. There were no barbershops. There was just a sharp downward decline in spending, the most dramatic of which was, in fact, spending on health services. That downturn was so sharp that first quarter GDP fell at a 5% rate. Of that 5%, 2 percentage points were diminished use of health services. People just did not go to the doctor. And so even though income continued to rise, and it's actually risen throughout this recession, spending fell. It was driven by that. And it was in particular spending on services by high-income individuals. That's important for where we go next, because to get that back doesn't mean that you have a bigger UI benefit where you send a check to a low-income household. You have to have something that gets relatively African Americans comfortable resuming their economic commerce. The second key part of this downturn was that the workers who were affected were relatively low-income workers who provided those services, waiters, busboys, and the like, in high-income zip codes. And so we have had this phenomenal divergence in the labor market where we lost 22 million jobs in March and April, 20 million in April alone, 10 times more than any single month of job loss ever before. And while we have recovered, the recovery has been taken the form of relatively high-skilled, relatively well-paid workers getting back to work. For those kinds of individuals, like me, the recession is essentially over, but we still have 11 million workers still out of work, and they are largely lower income, lower skilled workers. It's a labor market that is really diverged for them. And that's an important part of the story about where we go next. So in order to recover, there are, in fact, some obvious things we have to do. Number one, the public health mission, defeating the virus, remains the top priority, and we are faced with those challenges every day, especially at this moment as we've seen cases surging across the United States. We have had some good news that I can come back to in the Q&A if you want on the vaccination front, but even with vaccines, it's going to be well into 2021 before we sort of can stop thinking about the coronavirus. So this period reminds me very much of the period after September 11, 2001, when we realized that the American public faced a threat. At that time, it was terrorism, and the top priority was to defeat that threat. Here, that priority is defeat the coronavirus and eliminate it from our thinking. But the second priority was to learn how to operate the economy in the face of that threat. And back in 2001, that meant standing up a Transportation Safety Administration, the TSA, to make sure people could be on planes safely. It meant inspecting every cargo container that came into the United States for the first time. It was an enormously costly venture. We put bollards around every landmark building. We really spent an enormous amount of energy and investment dollars on the security mission. And that came at the expense of productivity enhancing investments and hiring. And during that period, we had what was called the Jobless Recovery. And anyone working at the White House was painfully aware of the slow recovery in the labor market. Here, we have to learn how to operate the economy and continue to operate the economy in the presence of the virus. And that, I think, means physical rearrangements of the workplace to get social distance, PPE, testing, continued efforts on therapeutics. We've seen remarkable improvements in the ability of the health profession to treat COVID-19, and of course, steady progress on the vaccination. So we have a challenge there. The second challenge we face is supporting the economy. Now, the initial support was simply remarkable. When the virus hit, the first thing that happened is people just disappeared from those service industries in particular. And the mirror image of that is for the people running those businesses, suddenly there were no customers and they had a massive cash flow crunch. The response in a cash flow crunch is pretty simple. Number one, sell anything you have to raise cash. And we saw a massive sell-off in financial markets early in the year. We saw big fluctuation, big roiling in the stock market, about 11% in one day. The Federal Reserve, to its great credit, recognized quickly the problem, and it's ran the playbook it learned back in 2007, 2008. It stood up facilities, that's a fancy term for it, electronically printed cash and offered to supply cash to anyone who had reasonable collateral and offered to an unlimited amount of liquidity for as far as the eye could see, and just pumped cash into financial markets. It worked remarkably well. I think one of the striking things about this recession is how well financial markets have worked throughout. Trading's been quite solid. And indeed, this is a recession, again, where the stock market has risen, unlike something we've typically have seen. And we've actually seen a very strong housing market as well. So the Fed did its job. Congress, I think, did a tremendous thing with the so-called CARES Act, the big stimulus. It tried to replicate the Fed's strategy. Let's just dump cash into every place we can. So let's have big unemployment insurance checks to households, write checks of $1,200 to each adult. Let's set up something called the Paycheck Protection Program and give loans to small businesses, which could be forgiven and thus turned into cash if they spent the bulk of the money on payroll. And the one that didn't work out so well, let's have a Main Street lending program for slightly larger businesses that'll do something comparable at a larger scale. But those programs taken as a whole really worked well. The household sector had $2 trillion more in the bank in August than it did in February. We saw employment growth resume in May and has continued since. We've saw $500 billion pumped out in the month of April alone to small businesses in America. And I think that response has been the key to the success we've had thus far in getting the economy headed back toward full employment and back toward trend growth. The issue of the day, of course, is whether that's enough, or do we need to do something more to continue to grow into 2021? I'm in the camp that thinks the balance of risks is that we should have some additional support for the economy. The danger here is doing too little, not doing too much. And in particular, I am concerned that with those 11 million long-term unemployed individuals, with their unemployment insurance running out and their financial wherewithal diminishing, we could see this turn from an unusual recession into a more typical income-driven recession coming out of that part of the household sector. And so taking some insurance against that by providing additional unemployment insurance and support to low-income households, support for renters and homeowners, I think it would be a sensible thing to do. We also know that we've lost hundreds of thousands of small businesses. About 25% of the small businesses that were operating in February are not operating today, and continued support for those who are the key employers in the economy, I think is a sensible thing to do as well. Everyone on this webinar knows that the politics of that have proven difficult, and I like to think I've spent the past 10 years trying to make good policy, good politics. That's how you get things over the finish line. And this is indeed a very difficult political environment. And so we'll see if we can get to yes between Republicans and Democrats in the lame duck Congress and the White House. But on the merits, I think something additional should be done. So imagine we get into 2021, and again, this 2020 is never going to be typical. Well, we don't really know what Congress looks like yet, and will not know until the 2 Senate runoff races are completed in Georgia in early January. But operating under the assumption that Republicans retain control of the Senate, we will be faced with a divided government, narrow Democratic control of the House, a narrow Republican control of the Senate, and a President-elect Joe Biden in the White House. And the question is, what will be the initiatives that the Biden administration will undertake? What will be the capacity of that divided Congress to enact them? And what is necessary over the near term to get continued economic growth? I think the short answer to that is the first thing to do is make no mistakes. And certainly, I think that the stated promise of President-elect Biden to raise taxes the moment he is inaugurated would be a mistake. The plans that he announced on the campaign trail, raising the corporation income tax rate, raising the top individual rate, raising taxes on dividends, capital gains, raising the amount of payroll that is taxable under Social Security for high-income individuals. Collectively, this constitutes a large and very discretionary tax increase at this point in time. The research done by Christine and David Romer in looking at discretionary fiscal policies and the kinds of impacts they have suggests that that's perhaps the most damaging thing that the administration could do. That a 1 percentage point of GDP increase would translate into a 3% decline over the next 2 years. That would be a headwind this economy does not need. And I hope the Biden administration is reconsidering those plans. I think that would be unwise. Second thing that they're quite likely to do is undertake some large spending programs. There, the issue will be, are they genuinely targeted on the problems that we have in the near term, or are they consensus long-term productivity building infrastructure and other investments that you can get bipartisan agreement on? To the extent that's possible, I think that those would be good things to do. Most people who have looked at this situation have really forecast a recovery that has a very clear, sharp recovery in the third and fourth quarters of this year. We're in the middle of that, and that seems to be on track. But then a much slower and more prolonged recovery, especially in the labor market. as we restructure the U.S. economy, something that happens coming out of every recession, but which will happen especially so coming out of this one, we will have for the foreseeable future a smaller commercial airline industry, for example, smaller leisure and hospitality. Those workers are going to have to find work somewhere else in the economy. Having some programs that would provide demand for their skills over the next several years, I think, is a good way to think about part of the policy portfolio, and strong infrastructure investments fit into that thinking. So I think a lot of the 21 issues are going to be driven by the degree to which the Biden administration tries to get its agenda through Congress. It's an enormously expensive, enormously high tax agenda. It seems unlikely that that's going to turn into their legislative successes. And so the real issue then becomes, what do they do on other fronts? And here I think I'd like to highlight two of the five big things I see facing the U.S. economy. I think they really do need to do a complete pause, rethink, and a relaunch of U.S. trade policy. The Trump administration has done tremendous damage to the rules-based international trading system. It had a fondness for bilateral trade agreements that I don't share. It had a set of tactics, tariffs, quotas, and confrontational international relations that I don't think was particularly helpful. And its decision to attempt to do a bilateral showdown with China produced nothing but a trade war with the two largest economies on the globe and no particular progress, in my view. This past Sunday, we saw the regional comprehensive economic agreement in the Pacific Rim, China, and 14 other countries. That now represents a third of global GDP, roughly, and it is the large multilateral agreement that the U.S. did not pursue. We elected to pull out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and I think we've lost not only the economic output and the goodwill of our allies from the past 4 years, we've lost leadership on global trade, something which the U.S. had maintained from the post-war to the present. And I think it would be important for the Biden administration to do so, to regain that leadership, be engaged in a multilateral fashion with rules-based trading and respect for the international institutions that enforce those rules. And that's been a big loss in the past 4 years. I also think that we're going to have to rethink the immigration strategy in the United States. I think I disagree with the Trump administration on essentially all their cross-border policies, and there is nothing more important to the United States than to have a pro-growth legal immigration system, and enforcement of illegal immigration is an issue that's separate from this. But at present, and it's been true for a while, the native-born U.S. population has sub-replacement fertility. We don't have enough children to even stay the same size. So that in the absence of immigration, we're like Japan. We get smaller and older and less consequential on the world stage. The flip side of that is that all of our future labor force, all of our future labor force productivity, all our future economic growth is dictated by the decisions we make about immigration. And immigration has always been a strong spur to U.S. economic growth. Immigrants are disproportionately entrepreneurial. They start more businesses, hire more people, acquire more capital and deploy it than do the native born. They work longer, retire later. They're a source of economic strength. And we've only ever devoted 5% of visas to economic purposes. If we were to reform our immigration system to have an economic focus and foundation, it could provide even more support to future growth than the current does. And so I think it's going to require an enormous amount of work. But those are two places where the Biden administration could set the tone and could change the direction in a big and significant way. The third big one will be the challenge that President-elect Biden says is the greatest challenge facing the world, and that is climate change. And if we are going to have success on climate change, in my view, it will require tremendous U.S. leadership. It simply will not happen without an enormous U.S. effort, commitment to produce reductions in emissions across the globe. And it's my read of the situation, beginning when I was on the McCain campaign that while the elites are quite comfortable with the idea of addressing climate change, the average American voter is not yet really prepared to do that. They view this as a really risky thing to get into, quite likely to hurt the economy. And if other countries don't contribute, the U.S. will have alone suffered a lot of damage and not accomplished any real success. And so for the U.S. to provide leadership and for the U.S. populace to permit its leaders to do that, we will have to have an extremely efficient approach to addressing the emissions of greenhouse gases. I think economists as a whole pretty much agree the right way to do that is to put a price on carbon and let businesses all across America figure out how they want to respond to the fact that carbon is more expensive, substitute away from it, innovate for efficiencies to use less carbon-based inputs, and in general, drive the innovative and entrepreneurial approach to addressing greenhouse gas emissions that we've used to address every other major problem in U.S. economic history. And so I think we can be successful on addressing greenhouse gas emissions as soon as we make it America's business's business to get rid of greenhouse gas emissions, and they will. But that will require getting the right policy. And the right policy is to have a carbon tax, which is set to achieve the environmental benefits, ramped up to that level in a fairly smooth fashion, so it's not too abrupt. And at the same time, reducing taxes elsewhere so as to not to raise the overall burden. And the right taxes to reduce would be taxes on labor, the payroll tax, taxes on capital, the corporation income tax. So the right mix is a reduction in corporate taxes, reduction in payroll taxes in exchange for a carbon tax. That's the textbook response that we need at the moment. That doesn't sound anything like what you hear people talking about. And so the probability of that happening in 2021 is very small. My concern is that instead they will attempt to implement their goals, a carbon-free electricity grid nationally by 2035, zero net emissions by 2050, using the administrative actions in the regulatory state. And that's the most expensive and economically costly way to address this problem. They have the authority, for example, to do lots of tailpipe regulation on cars, and probably will. But those have proven to be problematic from an economic point of view, and some of them have been litigated. The Obama administration tried to address electricity with his Clean Power Plan, got tied up in court, and so there'll have to be a different strategy there. The Energy Department is fond of putting efficiency regulations and rules on everything under the sun, water heaters, washers, dryers. They turn out to be expensive. It's a barrier to entry that reduces competition and has not proven to be very effective so far. So I would put on your radar screen as one where some judgments have to be made, how they address the promises they've made on climate, because that I think will be an extraordinarily important issue. Two other things that I think are issues not in 2021, but thereafter are going to be, number one, the federal debt, and number two, the state of K-12 education in the United States. For the federal debt, I'm a former director of the Congressional Budget Office. It is my lifelong duty to stand in public and say apocalyptic things about the federal fiscal outlook, but it's not hard to do that right now. We came into this recession with a financial picture for the federal government that was unsustainable. Spending was rising above revenues as far as the eye could see. Debt was rising even relative to GDP as far as the eye could see. And that was simply unsustainable. And the only question was when there would be some sort of attempt to correct it or some reckoning from not correcting it. During the course of the response to the coronavirus, we had enormous deficits, going to be over $3 trillion this year, elevated deficits next year. But the good news is everything Congress has done so far is genuinely temporary. And once we get past the first 2 years, they essentially go away. And we go back to the previous problem, which is a simple divergence as far as the eye can see. The trouble is we will be jumping off the highest level of debt relative to GDP in the nation's history. We used to say outside of wartime, but now that caveat's even gone. We are now into uncharted territory with the fiscal picture as far as the eye can see. Now, the minimum condition for a sovereign nation is that you be able to stabilize your debt relative to your GDP. And there's a very, very vigorous debate about whether it's really as bad as it used to be to have a high debt to GDP ratio. Given low interest rates, it's easier to carry that debt. And so perhaps we don't need to worry so much about it. Or maybe it'd be better to have a low debt to GDP ratio and stabilize it back around 40%, where we started out before the financial crisis. But all of that discussion presumes that you can stabilize debt relative to GDP. And in the 21st century, the United States has not done that. It has not had the political economy and the wherewithal to raise taxes, control spending, grow rapidly enough that debt stabilizes relative to GDP. That challenge awaits us. And so in the aftermath of what will have been a horrible public health event with over 250,000 deaths already, a horrible economic event where we fell 9 full percentage points in the second quarter of 2020 alone. The worst year of the Great Depression was 12. So we had nearly the worst year of the Great Depression last spring. We'll be asked to do something difficult, which is raise taxes, control growth in federal spending, particularly the safety net programs, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, Affordable Care Act. And that I think is going to be just an enormous challenge. Last one, and then I'm going to close and let some questions get answered here, is I worry every day about the K-12 education system in the United States. We do a national, an annual assessment of educational progress, the NAEP scores, and they take a look at third and eighth graders. And for 10 straight years, that assessment has concluded that a quarter to a third of third and eighth graders are seriously deficient in their ability to read at grade level and or do arithmetic and math. That's condemning a quarter to a third of future workers to an inability to compete effectively. That failure translates into low graduation rates from high school. For those who graduate, they end up having all sorts of remedial problems in college and typically do not finish. And that's where you find the roots of a lot of the student debt problems that we have. There's nothing more important than reversing that and equipping those workers for the capacity to compete in the future. That'll reduce the inequality we worry so much about. But most importantly, if we do the things that are outlined, control the debt, have a sensible immigration system, an efficient approach to climate change, and make sure that we have a robust engagement with the rest of the world in a fair and competitive trading system, we will drive productivity growth to higher levels. And that in the end is the source of all increases in the standard of living and the thing that the United States has to do better on in the next 20 years than it has done in the past 20 years. And so I would say to you that we have an enormous number of challenges at this moment. There's no question about that. But it is my reading of American economic history that the American public has always been capable of rising to those challenges. It's not usually very pretty, but in the end, we're very practical people, and we'll find ways to move forward on all these fronts and reestablish the capacity to be successful in the future. So thank you for the chance to be here. It's truly an honor, and I look forward to the conversation and the questions. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much. Those were very insightful comments. My task is now to barbecue at you in an appropriately Texas kind of way.
Your task is to ask easy questions in a charming way.
Although there aren't any easy questions. I think that is one of the challenges. So I want to probe a little bit deeper on two issues you're talking about. One was in thinking about the very near term. Mm-hmm. You said that the danger is doing too little, that there needs to be additional stimulus. Sounded like you would particularly favor stimulus activity that was related to public infrastructure. You've done a lot of work in the past about the potential productivity benefits of public infrastructure. But you also told us that this recession was really hitting the service sector hard. Yep. How will that kind of stimulus activity help the service sector?
So I think the right package addresses a couple of different things. So piece number one is the service sector problem, which I wanted to emphasize is a high income problem and will not be solved by conventional Keynesian stimulus, UI, social insurance, or the checks that we wrote earlier in the year. So that's the place where the public health mission is the ultimate piece of success. But between now and when the vaccines are widely available and effective, and we don't have to worry about the virus anymore, it is how do you make people confident to operate their economic affairs in the presence of the virus? For businesses, they have to be confident to open. I think that's where the business liability piece Republicans have talked about comes in. For workers, they have to feel like it's safe for them to go to work. And that involves rearranging some workplaces, like meatpacking facilities, moving production lines further apart, PPE. And in some cases, it's just better testing. We are seeing the improvements on the testing that I think have been dramatic. We had the first home use test approved by the FDA today. That's a step toward a world not far away where you can get up in the morning and take a strip, put some saliva, see if it turns blue. If it turns blue, you stay home. If it's red, you can go out and conduct your affairs. Combinations of those things are how you deal with services until the virus is gone. Then there's the fact that we have a pocket of people who I think are going to be financially quite distressed. That might not be enough to generate a recession, but it would be a disservice to not take care of those Americans. And so that's the traditional checks, UI, assistance for renters who can't make the payments, things like that. That's all near term. That's kind of cash flow stuff and safety. But when we get a year from now, so we go out to the fall of 2021 and into 2022, we're going to need to have some sort of support for the economy that's broad-based and which will generate demand for labor. That's where I think the infrastructure comes in. I don't want a Congress trying to do, shovel-ready projects again. We've seen that mistake. Pass a surface transportation bill that is the type that you would normally want, that gives you good, high productivity road investments. Put it in place. It'll take a while, but when we get a year and a half out, it'll be kicking in at the time we need it. So that's the kind of package that I think would be desirable.
Okay, cool. So you also, in talking about the dangers in doing too little, and then you pivoted to talk a bit about the debt and about the need to get spending under control,
right,
which kind of implies that there's a point at which we're going to have to take a foot off the gas and
Yes.
start pulling that stimulus back out of the economy with either increases in tax rates or reductions in spending. When will we know it's time to switch from stimulus to debt reduction?
So I think you have a two-part test. Test number one is you see the unemployment rate back to something, quote, normal. We can fight about whether normal is really 3.5% or whether 4.5 is going to be the new sort of natural rate for unemployment, but it's certainly not 7, it's not 8, and it's not going to be 6. So you got to get unemployment back down so that people are back to the jobs that they can get, and we're generating new jobs to absorb flows into the labor force. So that's test number one. Test number two, if you've got the Federal Reserve, which can move more nimbly and more quickly in full stimulus mode still, it's too soon, right? When they start pulling back on some of their stimulus, start raising rates, start stabilizing the size of their balance sheet, then we'll know that we're seeing financial market indicators and or inflation indicators of full recovery. And then Congress needs to recognize that going forward over a sustained period, they need to get things on track. It doesn't have to be 1 year. Believe me, the corrections that are necessary are so large that they're going to be implemented over a decade, and that's still going to be awfully hard.
You said something that really struck me. You said that everything Congress has done so far is genuinely temporary.
Yes.
I've been watching Congress, and there are a lot of things that my textbook says are temporary that don't seem to have the political will to make temporary. Things seem to be persistent. Were we going to have the political will this time to wind some of these things down?
I don't know. It's a good observation, a perfectly fair observation. It is absolutely true that what's on the books has been essentially temporary. CARES Act, the PPE program goes, pandemic UI goes away. The Families First Act, which gave us the first paid leave programs and things, those all go away. But it's not obvious some constituencies in Congress want them to go away. If they had their druthers, they could make them permanent. I mean, and the HEROES Act that passed the House has all sorts of things that are intended to be permanent. So I'm not a fan of using emergencies like this as a way to get your preferred regular domestic policy agenda into place, and I've been trying to guard against that. There are people who are trying to do that, but so far it hasn't really happened, and that's had the benefit of providing support for the economy when we needed it, and also not adding to the long-term sustainability problem.
Mhm. Right. You said one of the things we should watch is the Fed. When the Fed starts pushing interest rates up, that is a signal that we can start to move, because the Fed is in a position of being substantially more nimble
Yes.
than the fiscal side of the house. Monetary policy is much quicker. But when those interest rates start going up, the problem of the debt burden is going to start binding and biting even harder than before, as those interest payments start taking all the fun out of being a public administrator.
Yes.
So could you talk a little bit about how rising interest rates are going to impact your outlook for 2020, or when you think interest rates are going to start to rise?
So I don't think interest rates are going to start to rise in 2021. I think of the two things the Fed's going to do, it will first shut down these emergency lending facilities and stop the large scale purchases of assets before it starts raising rates. That's the sort of monetary stimulus we're seeing now, just pouring this cash into financial markets. I think the manifestation of trouble that'll cause them to scale that back is not going to be inflation and thus higher interest rates. It's going to be financial stability. I worry a lot about people taking that cash and just betting on stocks in a relatively uninformed way and getting inflated equity markets. That's a lot like what we saw in 2000 and again in 2007. So keeping an eye on financial stability, I think, is something the Fed's going to put a premium on, and that's what will cause them to move, is my bet. So that's sort of observation one. Observation two is when the interest rates start to rise, that's going to be a good news moment, because it's not going to be that the Fed's raising them in a proactive fashion. It's going to be that market conditions are driving rates up. That means we're growing fast enough, and there's enough demand for investable funds for purposes of the economy that interest rates get pushed up. And instead of having a saving rate, as we do now, well into the double digits, so we're at 15% right now because no one wants to go out and spend their money, we have conditions on the ground such that people are out conducting themselves with a full scale of economic activity. So the interest rates is going to be, throw me in that briar patch. I want to see them go up because that'll be a sign of success elsewhere.
Okay, cool. So one of the folks in the webinar have asked that, assuming the GOP wins both seats in Georgia, the Senate will not likely repeal the Trump tax cuts. So what could Treasury do, or what could the president do to alter tax policy away from the Trump policies towards something more like the fulfillment of progressive dreams? So who's got their hands on what levers?
There are relatively few tax policy levers that the executive can pull, and that's good. I think, as a sort of slight aside, what we have seen in the past two administrations, between the Obama administration and the Trump administration, is an enormous overuse of executive authority. I think it is time to go back to regular order and get things through Congress, and I hope that's on the sort of governance agenda for a Biden administration. And that's long thoughts on how they could do that. But what could the Biden administration do? Number one, can do better enforcement of the existing code, right? So make it a priority for the IRS to audit high-income individuals and make sure they're paying at least the current statutory rates, and make sure that happens. And I think they would do that. Same is true for the new corporate code, which is quite complicated, exceedingly complicated, and where the Treasury can issue guidance on how to implement the rules and do a more rigorous enforcement of those rules. I think that'll be something they could easily do. Second thing they can do is they can, in some cases, raise and lower things like capital gains taxes by writing the rules on what constitutes the gain. This administration contemplated cutting capital gains taxes that way, but the game cuts both ways. I hope they don't do that. Excuse me. But that'd be a possibility. But I don't think they have a lot of options. It's largely an enforcement game.
Okay, cool. So switching a bit to some of your comments about immigration. One of the folks wants to know if there were to be an expansion in visas for economic purposes, won't that crowd out visas for humanitarian purposes?
Doesn't have to. That's a choice. You can simply allow for more total immigration into the United States. Again, the right way, in my view, to think about immigration reform is, pardon me, not something where you're worried about immigration rules that are the right ones for 2021 and then the right ones for 2022. It's what kind of an immigration system do we want to have over the next, say, 10, 15 years? Permanent structural reforms, what do we want to put in place? And so assume you're back at a situation where the unemployment rate is not artificially elevated because of the recession, then I think you could probably expand immigration and without any great difficulty. We've done it historically in the United States. We've had internal expansions called baby booms. We've had external expansions called immigration booms, and the U.S. economy has, by and large, been able to handle them quite well. It's the virtue of having a largely private sector, flexible economy, and so I don't worry about that too much. We shouldn't give up our humanitarian ideals in order to get faster growth. We should be able to do both.
Great. So one of the policy issues in the run-up to the election, and one of the issues near and dear to Texas hearts, are the questions of oil drilling and fracking.
Yep. And
the appropriate regulatory response and the impact of policy change in that arena on general economic activity. Can one quantify the amount of drag there would be on the economy from actions that would ban drilling rather than something more like a carbon tax?
I'll give you two answers to that. So first of all, the general notion of regulatory drag and is a real phenomenon. I run the American Action Forum, which is a DC-based think tank. And so for you, that means it's an over 21 daycare center. And so to keep the kids out of trouble every day, we do a number of things. And one of them is we read every regulation put out by the federal government, and we tabulate what the agency reports as the cost of complying with that regulation. So this is the agency's estimate of what it costs you in the private sector to comply with a new regulation. Regulations that cost more than $100 million are called major regulations. The Obama administration finalized a major regulation at an average rate of 1.1 per day, every day for 8 straight years. Total self-reported, these are their agencies, cost of compliance, $890 billion, or over $100 billion a year in stealth taxes on American businesses through the regulatory state. Trump administration came in and instituted regulatory budgets, said to the agencies, we're going to give you a number. You can impose no more than that number in costs on the private sector through your regulatory actions this year. All of their numbers were zeros and negative numbers. And so in the first year in office, essentially zero, flat, no increase in the regulatory state. Remarkable. It was like night and day for small businesses in America, from over 100 billion a year to nothing. And they then succeeded in the next years in knocking it down by 20 billion and 15 billion. But that difference, I think, had everything to do with the rapid pickup in growth in 2017 and into 18. And if they hadn't picked the trade war into 19 as well. So we're doing a lot of making a big effort to quantify that. On the sort of fracking, drilling, carbon-based fuels world, natural gas and oil, we've done some research on the economic cost of the regulatory approach versus the efficient carbon tax approach. And it's 3 to 1 more expensive regulatory if you have good regulations, and if you have sort of pretty bad ones, it's even bigger, 5 to 1. So I'm not a big fan of the regulatory approach, but I'm afraid that's the way they might end up going.
Cool. So one of the long-term issues that you raised was, of course, something near and dear to my heart, which is thinking about the K-12 education system. And trying to improve K-12 education system. But we're also sitting here at a university.
Yeah.
And student loan debt is something that the students are really worried about. Are you worried about it?
In the main, no, not like some people. There's a particular set of individuals who have the really big balances. They're people like my daughter who went to Yale Medical School and is now out paying those off and has a well-paying job and the capacity to pay it off. The troubled student loan borrower is the individual who's got probably a balance of $40,000, didn't graduate, spent 4 or 5 years and didn't finish. That's the bulk of the delinquency, arrears, and I think we need to deal with them in a very targeted fashion, and then recognize that student loan forgiveness doesn't give anyone more skills. We need to focus on the underlying issue, which is the acquisition of marketable skills and not how we finance it, debt versus equity, whatever. I mean, and we're not doing a good job on that front. That's what I'm worried about.
Okay. So if you were responsible, would you focus, or would you recommend that the new administration focus more of its attention on K-12 or on higher ed in terms of reform and return on investment?
So I would tell them they should do K-12, but they'll do higher ed because the impact's quicker. And the realistic fact of life has always been that you can make a big difference in 3 and 4 years if you have an effective change in higher education. And you can make an enormous difference in 20 years if you take on the K-12 education system. And the K-12 has largely been a state and local responsibility. So they just think, well, that's too long a payoff horizon. We're not going to get into it. But my concern, I'm not an education expert. I won't pretend to, so I don't know exactly what to do. But I look at the large amount of unhappiness with labor market inequality. It's largely traced to skills. You look at the sort of difficulties people have in adjusting to shifts in the economy, which we're going to go through right now, and that has to do with their capacity to learn new jobs. And I just think, how can we have a quarter to a third of our young people essentially not given even a fighting chance when they head out into the labor market? That doesn't seem like a smart national strategy.
Wonderful. Well, I could keep on going and going, but I'd like to actually turn things over to one of our excellent Bush School ambassadors, a student who would like to ask you a few questions. So I'd like to invite Samantha Surface to come and ask you a few questions herself.
Great. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Holtz-Eakin, for speaking with us tonight. So I get to proudly represent the Bush School students. So I have a few student questions for you.
Yeah.
So first, some career advice. What career advice would you give Bush students wanting to pursue careers in economic public policy, especially given the COVID world we currently live in?
I'll give you the following personal caveat first. There are two kinds of people in the world. One kind of person is my daughter. She knows what she's going to wear on July 6th, 2022. She plans everything. She wanted her career path to be exactly where it is right now. She's a physician's assistant in the neonatal intensive care unit at Yale Medical Center. And she told me 5 years ago that's what she wanted to do. So that's her. That's not me. As you may have noticed from the introduction, I can't hold a job. I was an academic, then I decided academia didn't work. I went to the White House, went back to academia, went to the White House, went to Congress, went to a campaign, ended up starting a think tank because I was an unemployed economist. And what else are you going to do? So my career advice is to know myself. I know the characteristics of jobs that I like. They involve numerical, quantitative analysis of public policy problems. It is important to me that there be a big communication function. You need to explain your findings in English to non-specialists. I especially enjoyed the pace of the activity. And sometimes academia, frankly, got too slow for me, a little ADD. So this is better. I can get the right mix. I enjoy doing a lot of different things. I'm extraordinarily shallow, but I like to cover lots of areas. And so I get to do that. And I love working with young people. And so I have built here my perfect job. I have a staff of 25 young people. We work across the waterfront of domestic and economic policy. And, we get to talk to audiences of very different expertise, and I enjoy all of that. I had to always put myself in jobs like that so that I would love them, and I did, and do real well at them. And if you do that, you will get the next opportunity. I can't tell you, like my daughter can, what that next opportunity will be, but it will come. There's no question. So I think know yourself. What's the environment you want to be in, and go to the right environment. Check it out carefully. That's my top advice. Less about which degree to get and where do you want to enter in academia, or do you want to start in a think tank, or do you want to go to a staff job in an agency? I think it's really more the environment you're in and the skill set that you want to provide to it.
Great. Very helpful. I have another question that's related to your time at the CBO. So what were some of your more challenging experiences and some of your most rewarding experiences while running the CBO? And then in addition to that, given the CBO's nonpartisan status, how do you think the CBO has fared in today's hyper-partisan world?
So let me do the latter first. CBO is a genuinely nonpartisan place, and that's a tribute to its founding director, the late Alice Rivlin, who built into it a DNA of nonpartisanship that no director could screw up. And I consider it an amazing accomplishment. I was the very first CBO director to go directly from the White House to the CBO. And for the Democrats in particular, there was a lot of question as to whether I could be nonpartisan. I mean, they just flatly didn't think that was possible. But in the end, the quality of the work that the staff does and the nonpartisan character of it wins the day. And the potential critics were mollified in my particular case, and have been in every case. And so it's just a gem of an institution. And I loved running it. It had 230 people, 190 of them with advanced degrees. There's someone there who knows more about everything than you do. And it's just so much fun to learn from all those people. On the other hand, you do have 535 bosses. Most of the difficult times at CBO were really just managing relations with the Hill, making sure that you don't surprise politicians in public. That's a mistake. If you're going to surprise them, do it in private. If you can avoid surprising them, even if it's good or bad news, don't surprise them if at all possible. Give them a heads up on things. It's mistakes of those kind that I think were the tough parts of my job. And the biggest fights are actually not over the major issues like the prescription drug bill and Social Security reform and the 2003 tax cuts and Terrorism Risk Insurance Acts. All these sort of enormous undertakings that we didn't produce the big headaches. It was some favored project by a congressman who you tell them it's going to cost 20 million when they thought it was going to be 10, and next thing you know, they're getting ready to kill you. And so, that a lot of it was that. The other thing you just have to get used to is that you serve sort of a psychosocial function for the Congress of being the person they kick when they have a problem. So they blame you for everything. And I just didn't take it personally. They yelled at me. That was fine. Yeah, I get it. You got to yell at somebody, yell at me. But some directors have told me that got hard on me. And so I as long as they yelled at me and not the staff, the staff's off limits. They're doing their job. You leave them alone. That was fine. My finest moment, very personal to me, it was CBO did a lot of work on a contract that the Air Force had gone into with Boeing over air refueling tanker planes. And we did it at the request of the late Senator McCain. And it was Enron-esque in its ridiculousness. They set up a shell company in Delaware to buy the planes from Boeing, lease them to the Air Force over the next 60 years at an enormous markup. It was a terrible deal for the taxpayer. It was done entirely to circumvent the appropriations process and essentially violate the Anti-Deficiency Act, which you can go look up. It was a horrible deal. There's also turned out there was some actual graft involved, and OMB purchasing officials went to jail. Some Air Force guys went to jail. But I was asked to testify along with other agencies like the Government Accountability Office and other support agencies about the contract in front of the senator. And at the end, he did his usual, knowing what you know, I'm going to go down the line, just ask you yes or no, should we go forward with this contract? And the GO guy said, well, I can't tell you what to do. And the CRS person said, I can't tell you what to do. You're the senator. And I said, no. And I heard my whole staff behind me inhale. But I thought it was just obvious we were doing our job if we said no. And I thought I was doing my job. And that is how I ended up as the director of domestic economic policy on the John McCain campaign. So that was my best moment.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Appreciate it. I'll hand it off to Dr. Robertson.
Yeah, thank you so much, Samantha and Ms. Service. It's really been amazing. Those are great questions. And we'd like to especially thank our audience and Dr. Taylor for the great conversation, but especially to Dr. Holtz-Eakin. I mean, you've shed so much light for us on the economic situation for 2021 and given us so much to think about. And unfortunately, we wanted to offer you applause. We can't quite do that. We'd like to give you some virtual applause to know how much we appreciate your comments and your thorough discussion. And we hope that you will visit us once we recover from COVID and we can bring you down to College Station.
So here and now, I promise you, I'm coming to College Station first chance I get. And here now, you have to promise me, and since I can't hear you, hey, who knows, that you'll show up. But
absolutely. No, it'd be our pleasure. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for attending. We appreciate it. Have a good night.